welcome. I'm Devin Reef, Principal Planner with East Bay Regional Park District, and this is our 8th and final meeting of the Trail User Working Group. Before we get started, I wanted to introduce Christina Kelchner, our Assistant General Manager, who will get things started for us. Christina.
Thanks, Devin. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Oh, yes.
Great. So thank you all for being here. I am Christina Kelchner, and I am the Assistant General Manager at the Park District. I oversee trails, planning, stewardship, design and construction, and land acquisition. So all of the kind of future planning of our parks, and as well as the stewardship of the natural resources. We have interesting conversations in my division. So I really just wanted to pop in today and thank you all so much for being here and volunteering your time for this really important conversation. Trails are the #1 way that people engage with the parks and with the outdoors here in the East Bay. So making sure that inclusive trail access and safe trail access is really important. This group came out of the workshop that we had in 2019, which was a workshop that I led and pushed for. And then out of that, working with some of you, came this idea to have a trail user working group where you all could hear from each other. So I know there's been a lot of interesting conversations and honest sharing of perspectives. So I just really thank you for that. It's just invaluable to us as staff and to the board as well to get that input and hear from all the different perspectives. And I also wanted to let you know that we will now be taking the information you've given us, summarizing it in the report, and taking it to our Public Advisory Committee. That's a body of 21 people that are appointed by our board. They're community leaders, and they represent the community and give input to the board on issues that are of significant public interest. And so we are going to recommend to our board executive committee, which is a subcommittee of our board, 3 of the board members, that the board direct the PAC to take up these trail use issues. So I just wanted to let you know that all of this work that you've done is not just going to go into the ether and disappear. It's really important to us as we elevate this conversation and take it to the next chapter, the next phase. All of your input will be considered, and we'll kind of lay the groundwork for starting to move towards finding some solutions. Because we, at the staff level, and many of you have been involved for decades, really. And so we are committed to new approaches, new solutions, and really working together with the community to find solutions that are going to work best for everyone. So I wanted to thank you for your time. Devin's going to go over the agenda in a minute today. And one of the things that we're going to get to today is really getting the Trail User Working Group's input about what the scope of the question should be that the PAC will take up. There's a lot to talk about with trails. There's new parks, there's existing parks, there's bootleg trails, there's e-bikes, there's all kinds of things to talk about with trails. And we want to get the Trail User Working Group's input about how to frame up that question for the PAC so that it's meaningful, but not completely unmanageable as in terms of something that they could kind of bite off and make some recommendations on by the end of this year. So that will be, I think, our meaty discussion for today. And with that, I just really, again, just thank you so much. And it's, one of the best things about public service is being constantly reminded of just the goodness of people and that you all are here just volunteering your time for this conversation to make our community better. It's wonderful. So thank you so much. And I will turn it back to Devin.
Thank you, Christina. Let me share my screen and remind everybody about the agenda. This was in the invitation if you don't have it, but let's quickly go over. We did want to make a change. So as Christina mentioned, the meeting objectives today really are to bring the Trail User Working Group to a close and to thank you for your service to the public and the trail using community. To transition this group to its next stages, which we'll talk to you about as the Park Advisory Committee will take up some of these discussions. And in just a minute, we'll be turning it over to Brian for the process update, but we'd like to move the summary report review and discussion from 3 o'clock to about 4:20, so about an hour from now, to really give us a lot of time to talk about the group discussion, the key issues referring to the Park Advisory Committee. And we're doing that to give more time right up front, but also because Christina can't join us for the entirety of today's meeting. So we want her to hear as much as she can. So then we'll talk a little bit about the summary report and then talk about completing the user group and discussing if there's interest in a social gathering. And then we'll close at 5. So that's the agenda today. Okay, Brian, why don't you take us through the process update?
Great, thanks, Devin, and thanks, Christina. And I know we also have our AGM of Operations, Jim O'Connor, here as well. So I think that's just indicative of how interested we are in this conversation and how seriously we do take it. As mentioned by Christina, and this group was formed in the wake of the board workshop to try to address some of the questions that we as staff have been wrestling with for a very long time. And as we saw through a series of correspondence towards the last part of last year, there's a number of us who've been in this conversation for a very long time. It can feel a bit like Groundhog Day in that we kind of have the same conversation and we recognize the need to come up with solutions. I think, some of the things we've heard a lot through these, and I think there's a lot of common ground. I think everybody here, one, loves the Park District, loves trails. Everybody recognizes, I think, that the trails could be better, either a need for better stewardship and better resource protection, or a need for better connectivity, or a need for more mountain bike access, or a need for protecting equestrian access. There's a lot there to agree upon. The Park District is an old agency, and there's a lot of history in terms of how our lands have been planned in the past. And I think it's safe to say that that may not be the best way to plan for them in the future. And so that's really some of the questions that we need to tee up for our PAC to understand is should there be changes to Ordinance 38? Or should we look at, and I know there's been some correspondence going around about a trails master plan, or should we consider single-use trails like the Wildcat Flow Trail that's been proposed? Or perhaps we should look at some of our existing parks and explore some pilot projects. Like there's some discussion around the Briones pilot project. And then of course there's the new parkland and how we open it. So those are some of the questions of sort of the past way that we've done a lot of this planning. And I think from this process is evidence that, may not be the best way to provide access and may not be the most protective of the resources as we move forward, and may just be very cumbersome as well. So looking forward to kind of framing up those questions that we want to provide to the PAC. What are the key things that really needs to change to help sort of move this conversation forward? I'll share, and I think a lot of you probably have seen there have been a couple actions in the past couple of weeks that have kind of highlighted this problem. There was some enforcement action in Pleasanton Ridge around mountain bike access. There was a corresponding protest from mountain bikers who are asserting that they want to see some access now and not necessarily long into the future. So I do think it's important as we talk about what's the global solution. Is it a trails master plan? Is it something else that we still need to look at solutions that we need to implement now? There have been a number of plans that have been approved. We got projects in the permitting process. We have things in different stages. So we need to continue to be able to move things forward as well as doing the big things. So in terms of process, as mentioned, this is going to be the last meeting. We're going to take the input that we get from this meeting and all the input that's all been documented by Lou and Maria at MIG, everything that's on the website, and put that together into a final report. We're going to be bringing this forward to bringing a summary to our executive committee on Thursday. So a very timely meeting, and just really discussing, what we've heard, and then those areas that we feel need additional conversation and a deeper dive with our park advisor. And frankly, what we see is how do we accommodate, or how do we deal with the demand for mountain biking access in a way that protects the resources and provides for a safe trail experience. I think that's the crux of the issue. We've heard a lot about the need for more trails for dog walkers, the need for more trails for our new park users who just discovered the park district during COVID, a need for new trails for hiking and for hiking groups. We've heard about the need for resource protection and to address bootleg trails. We've heard about the need for more accessibility for those with mobility challenges, the need to provide equitable and inclusive access. We've heard all of these needs, and those are things that I think we can all agree on. And we've heard about the need to protect equestrian access. But really, as staff, we feel like until we answer this question about mountain bike access, how we manage and plan for that, we really can't do any of that. So that's really the question that we need the PAC to dive into is how do we address that? How do we come up with a process by which we can move forward and open up our new parklands? And then, of course, also, how do we address the trail networks within our existing parklands? So again, that's the executive committee on Thursday. I know many of you are already aware of it. I'm sure many of you have already given some thoughts about what your participation in that meeting and future meetings may be. And so the purpose of this meeting today, and what I think would be really helpful, is for us to hear from you. What is the problem statement? What do you think needs to be fixed for us to address that question and to address to improve our trail network in the park district? So that's the goal for today, and that's the process moving forward. Like Christina says, this conversation has been great. It's been illuminating for many. I think it's been a really important and valuable conversation to get everything out and documented. And then now we can really elevate it to our PAC. And there's a commitment to address this by our board. So a number of things sort of coming together at the same time with really exponentially increased demand for access to the trails. This group doing a lot of good work. Interest in our board and PAC coming up with questions. So we're hopeful that this is going to lead to good problem or solution-oriented conversations. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Devin, and again, and really deep, heartfelt thank you to everybody. I know you've volunteered your time, valuable time, and given a lot of passion and commitment to the park district, and we do want to definitely recognize that and celebrate that. So thank you very much. And I guess just last point, sorry. We do also hope and expect that you all will continue to contribute and participate in the conversation as this moves forward to the PAC. So your expertise and what you've heard in here and just your role in the community. And I know some people will be participating no matter what. I hope everybody has an opportunity to participate, because we do need to hear from all voices as this continues to perform.
Thank you, Brian. And for those who are going to watch this meeting later, we don't have every member of the Trail User Working Group with us today, unfortunately. So for those members who will be watching this in the future, We welcome your participation as this transitions to other bodies like the Parks Advisory Committee. So now let me turn it over to Lou Hexter, our fearless moderator and facilitator, to lead the next part of the discussion, the main part of the discussion. Lou.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this final meeting. I'd just like to add my thanks for your participation throughout the process and your fearless advocacy for your points of view and your perspectives. And I think we've assembled a really amazing group of individuals, both speaking from personal viewpoints as well as representing, I know, people behind you in associations and groups that you are part of. I also would like to lift up and acknowledge people who are perhaps new to this conversation, who have joined the Trail User Working Group because the district really wanted to make an effort to expand the number of voices, expand the reach and breadth of the conversation. And I want to acknowledge those of you who are relatively new to the conversation, and thank you so much for learning along with us, participating, and giving us your much needed perspectives. And so I think that is definitely a value added for this working group process from prior conversations. And I just wanted to acknowledge that, as well as those of you who are longtime veterans, who I'm sure have rolled your eyes at moments where you feel like you've made all these points before, and here we go again, but definitely worth speaking up and worth documenting them yet again. I think hopefully you've enjoyed the opportunity to converse with one another, to advocate for your point of view, but also I think I've seen a lot of open-mindedness and receptivity to brainstorming and problem solving. The main issue, as your fearless facilitator could say, is just there's a lot of love for the parks, more love for the parks than the parks can provide at the moment. Much more demand than there is, available resources and facilities, and we want to be really careful as we promote expansion of access, that we're doing it in a thoughtful and considerate way for safety, for resource protection, et cetera. So all of those things are in tension, and I was really impressed to read about how much the mountain biking community has grown over the past few years. Interest in mountain biking seems to have exploded, as well as through the pandemic, just a high demand on outdoor activities and access. So those are some of the things that are going on that we have to acknowledge as we move policymaking into the next phase. So the conversation, as has been mentioned, that we wanted to have with you today is, given all of the things that we've talked about, raised, not just the issues, but also some of the solutions and potential strategies, pilot projects, or things that you'd like to see the district try on. We wanted to use our time today to focus us on what important things you think are needed in order to make the Policy Advisory Committee discussions on trails really impactful and move everything forward. I'm here. Maria Mayer is here from MIG as well. She's going to be taking notes, and our conversation today is going to be documented and included in the final transmittal of the working group process to the Executive Committee and to the Policy Advisory Committee, or Park Advisory Committee. So, so that's, just wanted to let you know that as well. Before I open up the floor, I just want to ask you again for being respectful. It's perfectly fine to provide an opposing viewpoint. Please do so respectfully. And I know there's a lot of you who want to speak up today, so just use our normal process of clicking the raise hand feature, if you would. And I'll try to, I think they sort by the time that you raise your hand, so I should be able to call on you in the order that you want to speak. For those of you who may not have the entire time with us, please don't hesitate to write your comments into the chat. We will collect all of that as well. If you don't feel like speaking up on the microphone, you can type in your comments in the chat, and we've enjoyed documenting those as well. Okay, so are we clear on the question at hand? Really, the key issues that you would like to raise up, lift up, and or potential solutions that you'd like to lift up to signal to the Park Advisory Committee for the work that they're about to do. So looks like Morris has got his hand up first, followed by Kathy, and we'll just take hands in order that we see them. Okay, Morris. Morris, I don't see you. I can see your...
You're muted, Morris.
Okay. Okay, what I'm hoping is that in this conversation, we can deal with the issues that we did not achieve consensus on and approach them one by one. Some of them are, the differences are based on some misunderstandings or lack of information. Some of them are based on big differences in ideas. And I'm trying to get the sound to show up. But I think that it should be possible to deal with them one by one and to debate to try to come to some kind of consensus on them without wasting time on all the things that we do agree on. So some of the things that I noticed that we had a real split on that might be easy to resolve are the issue of camping, which we didn't really discuss very much, the issue of encouraging regional trails, which we didn't discuss very much, the issue of sensitivity and enforcement of the laws so that minorities don't feel persecuted in the parks. We didn't deal with that very much. These are not central issues, but there was big disagreement. I think if worded differently, we might come to different conclusions. The other one that probably takes the most amount of time is trying to come to some kind of consensus on the issue of shared use of trails. And actually, we had a survey question on it and people voted and there was some split. And then when the survey was presented, the wording had been changed. And that isn't right, but the wording that it was changed to was actually an attempt, I thought, to try and find a consensus position in the middle. And it might not be the exact wording that's best to do that, but there might be some alternative wording that we could come up with that the vast majority of us could agree on. So that's what I'm hoping to see from this meeting is careful consideration of those issues and attempt to reach consensus on them.
Great. Thank you, Morris. I wrote down, I think, the ones that you highlighted for us. And I think I'd like to see what else is on other people's minds. And then maybe, as you suggested, we can go through each of those issues and see if there's any further discussion on resolving those. So, and what I heard from you was camping, regional trail connectivity, the enforcement issue, and shared use of trails. So yeah. Is that right? Yep. Did we lose you? Okay. You're muted again, Morris. You're muted. There you go.
Just pressed, okay.
There you go.
Morris, it muted you again.
What I'm suggesting is that when we're talking about one issue, we stick to that issue. We're talking about camping, limit it to camping, finish that, move on to regional trails, finish that, and don't talk about multi-use until we get to that topic, because otherwise we'll never finish. That's all.
Thank you so much. All right. And I'm proposing that we circle back onto each of those after we've had just one quick round of raising issues from everybody. So, Kathy?
Well, I have this photo behind me of an area that's new to me in Castro Valley that includes East Bay Mudland, where I was standing. That's the Ridge Trail, and several different East Bay regional parks. And I just want to emphasize that we really are talking about a lot of space. There really is 250,000 or so acres of open space if you include all the different entities that control land. and that the East Bay Regional Parks is the main one that provides recreation, and that in all the many acres of land, there should be a place to find the multi-use trails. And I really have a question, and I do mean this as a question, basically for Norman LaForce and for the people who are opposed to bicycle use on trails as opposed to fire roads. Are you categorically opposed to that? Or is there some place in the East Bay Regional Parks that you think might be a reasonable place to have rather narrow trails that are open to bicycles and other recreational uses?
When Norman speaks up, maybe Norman, you can respond to Kathy's question there. Did you have any other points to make at this point, Kathy?
No, I'm finished for now.
Thanks. Okay, thanks. Okay, all right. Okay, Amelia, looks like you have the next hand up, and then it looks like Jim. Go ahead, Amelia.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. In terms of what the PAC should be considering, in last month's PAC meeting, when Brian made a presentation, he did suggest that they would be taking on this issue. And there are several aspects to that. One of the PAC members expressed a desire for there to be a meeting of the minds among us in the Trail Users Working Group. Well, there really isn't a meeting of the minds. And the question of narrow multi-use trails is really the central issue. To Kathy's point, yes, there are ways of accommodating all users, and I know I'm not unique in saying that perhaps there could be places where bicycle trails could exist as a separate trail from other users, so we could kind of relax on the trail. And the way of identifying appropriate locations for these trails is going to be a big deal. It's going to be necessary to have a framework, a system whereby possible locations can be vetted, and it should be done in a highly systematic fashion rather than having individual locations pointed out as a possible attractive site for a flow trail. So that is the central thing I would like to see the PAC address, is what will be the systematic fashion for evaluating what trails are suitable for multi-use. There's been quite a bit of confusion because where Brian said to the PAC in response to a question that all new trails are not intended to be narrow and multi-use, it appears that that is exactly the nature of the trails that are currently on the drawing boards or have recently been built in Crockett Hills. So I think some of us are skeptical, and we believe that the default would be narrow multi-use trails. The McCosker trail design has not been addressed or evaluated or discussed, and that's something I think the PAC is going to have to take a look at, because I don't want to have to chain my body to the bulldozers there. I really don't. Yeah, let's see. Finally, a test needs to be run. If the bicycle advocates have stated that if they have more access to trails and they prefer the narrow ones, they will therefore not tear up the environment by digging bootleg trails. Consider an example from another agency, the City of Oakland's Joaquin Miller Park, which is generally recognized as a very liberal environment for mountain bike use. This past month, there was a tragic situation. I sit on the Friends of Joaquin Miller Park board, and our organization plus the Bicycle Trails Council of the East Bay each ponied up $5,000 for materials to build a split rail fence to protect the Fern Ravine area, which is quail habitat and sensitive riparian vegetation. Eagle Scouts took the materials and constructed a beautiful fence. about a week or two later, vandals came in the middle of the night and sawed down that fence in order to restore their access to the bootleg trails that it was intended to correct. So we're seeing that the bicycle community responsible folks are not influencing the bad actors. A test needs to be run. If we give the bikes their own dedicated trails and more access, will it really curtail the law breaking and the destruction of the environment? So that's how I'd like to see the PAC approach this problem. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Amelia. Appreciate your comments there. Okay, Jim and then Adela. And we do have some things coming in the chat, so keep monitoring that for us. Okay, Jim, go ahead.
Great, thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. Gosh, I just kind of want to step back and kind of look a little bit bigger for a moment. I think it was called a Trail Users Working Group. I hope that's not my mic, but I hope it was called Trail Users Working Group because I have heard this kind of a phrase of mountain biking is getting more popular. So we all know that hiking and trail use by people on foot is becoming more popular too. And I'm sorry, I'm hearing some mic issues. So I may have to type it up. I also think this is a new day. This is very different than what's been coming because of the increased use in our parks, because of the addition of e-bikes, because of all these issues. I think this is a very new time, and I think it has to be looked at in that way. And I also think we have to be looking at all the user groups, not just kind of focus on mountain biking, because then we're just really not looking at the whole picture, and it's kind of a blind spot, I think, in terms of just using that approach. I'll just add that I think options and pilots need to be looked at. But what's really important in all that is that, again, it gets to all the stakeholders being involved from the beginning, all the stakeholders being involved from what the objective is. And I would say that it's just not clear that that's taking place. So those are just a couple of things that just come to mind. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Jim, very much. Adele? Adele?
Thank you. I'm sitting here nodding my head along with, the comments of everybody who's spoken before me. And I really strongly feel what Amelia said is the right way to go, which is we need to look at the district overall. We need, and you've heard me say this before, we need to look at what trails are available to which user groups where the needs are, what those user groups' access is to trails. For example, I would imagine, I don't know, because I'm not an equestrian, but if you don't live right by a trail, you probably drive to your trailhead with your horse. Whereas a kid who's on the local mountain bike team or, is going to ride their bike to the trail and they don't drive. And so that's another factor that goes in there. And then we also really need to, I was surprised that in previous conversations, regional connectivity was not emphasized. I see that as a huge opportunity and that we really should be looking at that. So again, a big map of everything and looking at all these things, I think is what we need to look at, because again, just focusing on, like Crockett Hills, it's like, well, it's a pain to drive to Crockett Hills with a bunch of kids, and especially, and we're hearing complaints about Crockett Hills being overused. The other thing is that I totally think we should there should be a pilot program. If we're going to try something different, try having narrow trails for certain users or try alternate days for different user groups. My thing is not everybody needs to be on every trail all the time. So that's a way to handle that. And I know Brian has mentioned that, but this group was not really very supportive of that. And then what was the other thing I was going to say? And just as an aside, remember that fire roads are conducive to high speeds if you're on a bike. It's like if you're driving in a car, if you're on a wide road, a wide lane, you easily go faster. But you notice that when you're on a road where the lanes are really narrow, you slow down. And, that's the beauty of narrower trails for mountain bikers is not only does it slow you down, but also, it challenges you technically. So you have to steer better and you actually become a much better and safer biker when you get to practice on those. So anyway, that's what I had. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Billy. And I see Scott is next, followed by Luana. Go ahead, Scott.
I think Brian stated it well, that it's mountain bike access while protecting stewardship and safety is what the PAC needs to address. And I think they need to both look at short-term and longer-term. The longer we go and don't address it, we continue to have stewardship issues with rogue trails, and we continue to have conflict. So I think there are things, particularly in the realm of management practices, that can be piloted in a much more near-term fashion. Those are on trails that are existing. There are not significantly new stewardship issues there. So I think they lend themselves to much quicker implementation. And I think there will be things to learn there, but we can start learning with real practice. In the bicycling perspective, we talked about landscape level regional planning. So we had talked about that early on. We believe that's important. And for the points that have been brought up, both the discussions outside and points Adaly was making today as well. So I think that those are the key things I see. And in management practices, I think change in use, particularly to affect things early on, should be considered. We have those resources, and taking a look at flow patterns and where users are, it could be very reasonable, I think, in some cases, to put bikes on trails where they're not, and to maybe make some of those trails today that are excluded to bikes, perhaps bike only, if that creates a way to separate users and improve the experience of all trail users. I think that's controversial, and it is harder to affect that type of change when it changes what's going on for a user group that has had a trail for their exclusive use for decades. But there's been exclusion for decades as well, and that's not working. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate what's been raised also about the management practices and the opportunities that this group has talked about for pilot testing some of the ideas to see how they work. Luana, and then I see Austin's got his hand up.
Hi, I just wanted to bring up a different perspective from some of the topics that we've been speaking about. I know that a lot of us have seen Norm's latest letter, and kind of what was disheartening in it is how Outdoors for All initiative and then also underserved communities were used in that letter. And I kind of felt like it was used as a front to try to pass an outside stakeholder group that's not in spirit with this process, and further to pass a different agenda. So, if you're going to be referring to Outdoors for Alls or underserved communities, it's important that you actually have those communities signing on to letters, and that we have real discussion of how this whole process connects to those different initiatives. So there hasn't been a discussion about Outdoors for Alls, and outside of the discussions that Vision Hispana, Outdoor Afro, and then my presentation on inclusive planning, there hasn't been that type of discussion. So it's just disheartening to see it connected. And then you see people who sign on to the group and organizations that aren't connected with those populations. So that was just my comment. And that if we actually are going to include underserved communities, that we go to those communities and we have them represented on any discussions. And there are several communities that I could name that we all work with, as far as East Oakland Collective. But as far as if that's going to be part of the conversation, then, you know, they need to be invited. So just be wary of proposals without those individuals on it who represent those communities. So that was my only comment.
Thanks, Luana. Austin?
Yeah, thanks for those comments, Luana. And in reference to the letter that she was mentioning that came from Norm and a subgroup of this participants, I'm a little disheartened that the mountain bike advocates were never acknowledged in this letter or invited to sign on to it. It's as though we were excluded from this discussion. And I feel like that's just more of the same from those actors. We're here in good faith, collaborating from the get-go, have made proposals all along in this process. And yet at the 11th hour, this group has hired a consultant to draft some letter to come up with some outside initiative. Just smells fishy to me. I don't know what the intent is there, but my guess is to do more analysis. And there's a saying, you know, paralysis by analysis. And that's where we're at right now, is we constantly and have been talking about trail access for decades here. And the fact remains that less than 20 miles of trails have been built in decades. So it's time to move forward. And so, as Scott pointed out, mountain bikers proposed in our presentation that a regional trail plan be undertaken, but not at the expense of managing the current need for more access. We heard it from the general manager. There's a need, there's a obligation. It's part of the mission of the park district. So we can't continue to study and study and study and then require more CEQA. I feel like that's just a delay tactic. And while it sounds good, and of course we're all behind doing the right studies and looking at the right analysis, that doesn't get us more access, and it doesn't deal with the issue that we're currently having. So we need to take action. And that brings me to my points for the public, the PAC, and what I would like them to look at, which is looking at ways to manage the current trail system. Again, the mountain bike group proposed a number of alternative management techniques that are not building new trails, but managing the system that we have in a different way. And there's plenty of other examples. So I encourage the PAC to look at what other land management agencies are doing around the Bay Area that are in fact creative and is effectively working. And we provided a number of examples for where to look on those. Secondly, e-bikes have to be addressed by the PAC. Doing a pilot study on a couple paved paths is not addressing the current reality, which is e-bikes are getting used all over the natural surface trails. So how is that going to be addressed and looked at going forward? Thirdly, connectivity has been raised. Again, the mountain bike community brought this up in a significant way in partnership with the Bay Area Ridge Trail. We've been advocating for increased connectivity along the Ridge Trail alignment for years. And so I would like that to be continued. And as part of that, I want the PAC to think about how East Bay Regional Park might work a little bit closer with East Bay Mud, which manages thousands of acres right up against the borders. And many of the trails go between the two properties, and especially along the Ridge Trail alignment. That needs to be figured out as to ways to provide more equitable, safe access, utilizing the existing East Bay Mud Fire Road system. I'd go on, but those are big points. Bottom line is we need to figure out a way to provide more safe, equitable access closer to home soon and not 20 years from now. Thank you.
Austin, thank you so much for those perspectives and delineating a few really key issues for PAC to talk to. All right, Mimi, I see you're doing it the old-fashioned way. raising your hand. No, that's great. I'm glad I could catch you visually. So go ahead and unmute yourself. There you are. Go ahead.
I have no idea where the hand is on my screen. That's why this is the hand, I know.
That works.
I represent Regional Parks Association, and we had a board meeting this morning, and guess what we talked about? So the message that RPA as a board would send to the PAC is to start agreeing that all trails are not necessarily for all people at all times. We would also like them to recognize that things really are different. We are privileged to have Jerry Kent, retired AGM of Park District for years, and he knows all the history of it. And as we were talking about one of the aspects of trail management, the Pleasanton Ridge situation came up. And quite a few people were amazed that a helicopter would go after them. And Jerry said, you know, this conversation has gone on before, only we had a huge problem with motorcycles in the 60s and 70s in the Park District. I don't think many of us realize it. And they essentially solved it with the helicopter. Now, the helicopter was bought for other purposes, but that made a big difference. And so we talked in our board about the fact of using targeted helicopters, if necessary, to help enforce, because this group, signs didn't work, education didn't work. They were cited and the kids were giggling. So there are those rogue groups. The other thing, important thing that we would like to send to PAC is that trails for the most part are managed within the loop up, the land use plan of the individual parks. Things have changed enough by the numbers of people, the kinds of people, the vehicles used in, that those loofahs don't have, they're piecemeal. And so we too believe there should be an overreaching guideline policy, whether you call it a trails management plan or master plan for trails or whatever. And the board also agreed that pilot processes with the trail would be useful to help, but not just to see what the users of the trail, what kind of damage they do to the trail, but the pilot must be long enough to also look at the damage, not just on the edges of the trail or a road trail, but does it, do road trails come off of it? What happens to the plants, the vegetation, and the wildlife, including the birds? Last thing is, all new trails that the Park District is even doing now must have a very beginning transparency for the public. Okay, that's it.
What do you mean by transparency, Mimi? Just how the decisions are being made around the trails? Is that what you're referring to? The transparency part?
Yes, that there'd be a, I don't know which point. I'm sorry, I can't hear you very well. Yes, the transparent process is really needed at the beginning.
Got it. Right. I wanted to make sure that I was understanding what you were saying. Okay, thank you so much. Norman, it looks like you're up next.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this has been an interesting time dealing with this issue. As I've always advocated, it would be good to get the groups together and try to work something out in a constructive way. There is an inherent conflict on the narrow trails with mountain bike use. And that's clearly, I think, recognized by everybody. So that's at least one consensus point, I would think. And that is, so there needs to be a way to figure out how we deal with that issue and do it in a way that reflects the fact that the great, vast majority of users, that's close to 60, 70, even 80% are hikers, walkers. That has to be respected. One of the other problems that needs to be certainly addressed is enforcement. I have to say, it was sad to see what went on at Pleasanton Ridge with mountain bikers where they shouldn't be, and then getting very upset that they were being ticketed, even though, as the police chief noted, they were in areas they weren't supposed to be. They were sensitive areas. They were on rogue trails. And the response was not, well, gee, we kind of didn't realize, or we won't do it again. It was, how dare you do this to us? And the same thing with the sawing of the fence in Joaquin Miller. So there needs to be a way for how we actually police what's going to be going on in the parks with regard to mountain bike use. Frankly, this is not anything different from what the Sierra Club members have experienced in Marin with the mountain bike community. And so unless there's really strong enforcement, we're going to have some real issues here with how we deal with these, with what is this group. It's clear that everybody talked about dealing this from a broader approach, one trail at a time. So the notion that somehow talking about a regional context for this, some sort of master plan, is some cooked up concoction by Norton and this group. That's why I think the idea was to put this whole issue to the PAC to get a completely regional park district perspective from the Public Advisory Committee. And that's what needs to be done. You really can't do this piecemeal. And what is disturbing about the piecemeal is, as Mimi's pointed out, it's not necessarily transparent. I don't know where this proposal came for the Mizu Trail. Unless somebody wants to show me the Park District packet and agenda where the board authorized this going forward in a public meeting, properly noticed, I only heard about it through the grapevine. And we're finding out now that there's this proposal for a flow trail in Wildcat Canyon Park in an area that many people consider to be very sensitive. And there was no transparency to that. Just like there was absolutely no transparency for the construction of the Crockett Hills facility, which the Park District has admitted was done improperly. So if this is going to go to the PAC, there needs to be a full transparent process that, includes all groups. That I've always advocated for that. Everybody needs to be included in a way that's transparent and brings everybody together to talk through the issues. And one of the major issues is the environmental impacts. And those need to be studied properly and fully. So SEEK was one way to do it, but they need to be fully analyzed. And the notion that somehow, well, we've got to get something going, so we want to do it. And well, we can't do the studies because they'll take too long to do. That's not the right approach. That's certainly in the fact that we're losing habitat due to not only human use, but climate change and due to impacts on our parks. You don't just chuck the environment to the side and say, well, too bad, we'll deal with that later. That's just not the right approach to take. And that also needs to be something that the PAC, if it's going to take this up, has to address. And in terms of rogue trails, I've hiked at the Pleasanton Ridge. Wow, there were lots of rogue trails, and they were clearly put in not for bikers to be safely going down a particular place. They were put in some of the steepest locations with the notion. You could clearly see they were there, so they wanted to have a high-speed trip down a narrow trail. And that's not safe. Not safe for the biker, and it's not safe for hikers and others. And it's also highly destructive environmentally. So there needs to be a better approach to how one deals with rogue trails and recovering the environment that is destroyed by the rogue trails. Finally, in terms of a regional or overarching approach, this needs to be done outside of this piecemeal approach. And it's interesting to hear Brian mention that, wow, we really have to solve this issue dealing with apparently mountain bike use because we really can't do anything else. We can't go forward. And yet the Park District continues to go forward with trails being proposed in various parks, in the Lupas and now this Mizu Trail. And that's so it sounds like what the Park District is saying is, oh, well, we need to have a overarching approach and work this through. But in the meantime, we'll just do this piecemeal approach and just keep doing business as usual. And that's what I'm hearing from everybody, is that we can't do business as usual. Finally, with regard to alternative use days and other things like that, if this is going to be proposed, I think the Park District and the PAC needs to look at how do you make sure people fully understand that there's going to be limitations on when they can go to a park. Where I live in El Cerrito, it's a good 45-minute drive to on a reasonable day without much traffic to get to Pleasanton Ridge. I don't look online ahead of time. I would never think of looking online ahead of time. Go, oh, okay, well, today's a nice Saturday afternoon. Gee, I want to go to Pleasanton Ridge and hike. Oh, I better check the Park District's website to see if that's a day that I can go as a hiker. Most people are just going to get in their car, drive, and when they get there, they're going to be sorely disappointed if that's an off day for a hiker to use the park. That does not promote support for the parks. That does not promote park use. It just creates a lot of frustration and unhappiness. So if people are going to talk about these different approaches like that, then they need to make sure how they're going to get to the vast majority of the public, particularly in the minority communities and others, that there are these restrictions, and somehow they're going to have an excellent website that points all this out, easy to use, if that's going to be the case. So there's a lot of issues here, and I think the last one with the PAC is that maybe very good to have the PAC look at this, but it has to be done in an open process where all groups have similar access and are treated the same by the PAC, where there's not special meetings with certain groups over other groups unless it's all known and properly noticed. There needs to be a really good process for how the PAC's going to deal with this, and where we go from here.
Thanks for all of those comments and mentions about process and what you'd like to see the PAC do and how you'd like to see them operate as a body. So I appreciate that. Joseph, you've had your hand up for a while, and I think Joseph is the last hand I'm seeing. So if you have a comment that you'd like to speak out on, go ahead and line up virtually by raising your hand or waving at me. So Joseph, over to you.
Thank you, Lou. Well, first, I love the story Mimi told about the helicopters getting motorcyclists out of parks. I just think that we can't enforce our way out of this mountain bike dilemma. There are many more mountain bikers and many more places for them to go and rogue trails to create than there ever will be enforcers, right? So if faced with that, I would recommend we have to create something with them so that they take part ownership over it and see it as something that they help develop, and they will help market it. They will become influencers, and they will get their peer group to go to that area or go to those areas and use these trails that were set aside and set up for the mountain biking community. They will also take, we can label them as this is for the elite, this is for the novice, and that who's graduated from the novice trail to the elite trail. They'll take this on and they'll make it their own. Here's some why I know this would work, right? We don't see golfers in the park, right? Why? Because they're golf courses. We're not seeing a lot of, as I mentioned in the chat, people who didn't, communities that didn't have skate parks before were getting vandalized with skateboarders. And once you put a skate park in, the research has shown that that vandalism goes down if the park is designed with the skateboarders in mind, and if it's centrally located and the hours work, et cetera, right? We can do the same kind, we have bright spots. And I think if we mine those bright spots, we could pilot and solve for some of these challenges. But I want to leave you with that trying to enforce our way out of this. The stories we've heard is just not feasible. And if their bikers are laughing at signs or laughing at when they get fined, that's some indication that that's not the way I would proceed. So I see Mimi's hands up, so I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Joseph. Mimi, I'll get to you in just a moment. I want to call on Christina Kelchner, the assistant GM, just to speak up before she has to take off. So go ahead, Christina.
Thank you, Lou, and I apologize. I do need to head to another meeting here, but thank you so much for all of your comments. I've been taking copious notes here. I think that I'm hearing consensus that mountain bikes on narrow trails is the core issue that people would like to see the PAC delve into. So after I get off, you can, if anybody disagrees with that, please let Lou know. But I think that at least is common ground that people are agreeing that is the issue. Does anybody want to speak up on that and disagree? Common ground in terms of what the question is that the PAC should look at.
Well, I think it's broader than just narrow trails. Again, that's pigeonholing this as though the assumption is that all narrow trails are wanting to be open to bikes. And that's just not the case. That's not what we've been asking for. We're looking for a sensible, sane approach to building new trails, which some of them would be open to bikes and some would be open to other uses. So it's more holistic than just should bikes be allowed on narrow trails or not, which is the way
Austin. Thank you, Austin. I totally agree with that. I totally agree.
And I agree with Austin too. The whole point of us coming together was to see how we could work together to open some new trails in the East Bay Regional Parks, to have more access to all of this bank land, and in a way that's safe for all the different user groups. And so we keep on getting stuck on this bicycle and narrow trail argument. Since the first day this started, you had people sending around documents on narrow trails before the conversation even started. So people are just not working in spirit of why we came together. And I don't feel like we're there yet either, but that's a question. How are we going to build some new trails to increase access? And it would be great if we could answer that.
Luana, thank you so much for that. I agree with you. I think that when we did the trail workshop in 2019, what prompted it was staff feeling like we didn't know how to move forward new trails, wanting to bring forward building new trails in all of our land bank properties. And other than Crockett Hills, the Park District has not constructed a new trail in 25 years due to the public controversy. So that really is the foundational core issue. We can talk about e-bikes, we can talk about existing trails, But what prompted this discussion, and I'll say what my interest was, and the staff as well, was how can we expand access? The population is growing, the need for trail access is growing. We have communities that aren't served by trails and parks as much as they should be. How do we expand access overall? So I really appreciate that framing, and I would be pleased to give that framing to the board to recommend to the PAC. I did see, sorry, Lou, if I could step in for a second. I saw Helen Burke's hand up, and I know, Helen, you and I talked a lot around the time of the workshop. I'd love to hear your input.
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Christina. I think that, that's one of the experiences of being on this committee, is I think we came to it with different ideas about what the committee would do. And I, for one, thought, and I think I agree that trail access is important, but in order to proceed there, you need to have certain ground rules understood. And I think one of them is this whole issue of bikes on narrow trails. I think you need to have a policy or a resolution, a consensus, if you will, by which we can go forward. And so that's kind of the way I saw it. And I think that's an issue that remains unresolved. And one thing I'm interested in is how, going forward, how that issue and other issues surrounding the trails are going to be resolved. What is the process? Now, I understand it's all going to the PAC, but then how are we all of us now we're all interested in our, perspective. We're all trail users and we represent different interests, different approaches. How are we going to be folded into the PAC? You don't need to answer that now, but in the course of time, hopefully someone will address that. And while I got the floor, I just want to say, with regard to enforcement, my opinion and my perspective on enforcement through serving on this committee and going out and hiking the trails has changed. I came into this with being a believer in traditional enforcement, where the officer whips out his ticket book and all that kind of good stuff. I now think that might not. I hear the argument that to some people, an officer, in a uniform with a badge and all that stuff can be a fearsome sight to some people. So I am open to ideas about different approaches, and the targeted helicopter is something I hadn't thought of before until the recent Pleasanton Ridge event took place. And just lastly, I'll say that I'm concerned about e-bikes, the rise of e-bikes. I think in the Park District's Ordinance 38, your regulatory branch there, the e-bikes are limited to certain paved trails like the Iron Horse and others, regional trails, where I think the original idea was they'd be used for commuting. And now I think they are prohibited, at least on paper, on regular trails, in natural surface trails in the parks. And I think there's a definite problem there. And I don't know how there's the big E word, how are you going to limit that? Because signs don't seem to work. I think signs help, and they certainly educate people as to what is permitted and what isn't. But I think the rise of e-bikes are a real issue that the Park District needs to grapple with.
Lou, if I could jump in and just respond to a couple quick things there. Yes. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. On the framing issue, I think I'm still hearing that the foundational issue is how do we build more trails? And the challenge is what do we do about who gets to use those trails and who will those trails be designed for and who gets to use them? And it has been one of the biggest barriers to us being able to expand our trail network. Is that a fair characterization? Anybody want to comment on that?
Well, yeah, I think, that's certainly part of the issue. And I think if you want to talk about expanding the access to the land bank parks, that's actually a very bigger issue and separate in many ways from the issue about trail use on particular locations and on narrow trails. I mean, land bank, as the staff pointed out in a prior communication after one of our meetings, the land bank parks have all kinds of restrictions on them as land. The HCPs have restrictions on access and use. There are other restrictions that pertain to particular areas, particularly sensitive habitat areas that are in the land bank parks. So that's a much bigger issue, actually, and that really deserves a regional kind of approach to how you're going to handle opening up the land bank parks, because particularly if you want to have connectivity and trail access through them, because there are lots of areas in the land bank parks that are not going to be and cannot be opened to trail use of any type, even hikers. So, and that also requires, if there is going to be opening up, the right kind of environmental studies to make sure that you're doing it properly. Well, that takes time and money to do that. And so I'm all happy to do that. I mean, I think that's great, but that's a much broader issue than certainly what brought us here to the Trail User Working Group originally. And I don't want to go through that whole history. I'm just saying that that's a much broader issue. It requires a true regional approach that the Park District needs to engage in, and is just much broader than whether trails are opened up, narrow trails are opened up for particular uses or multi-use.
Hey, Christine, I want to make sure that you're getting what you need before you have to leave us.
Yeah, thank you so much. And again, I really apologize. I'm pushing my next meeting off as long as I can here. Just a couple of points of clarification that I wanted to make. One is that the Wildcat Trail proposal is just that. It's a proposal at this point. It hasn't been proposed by the board. It's just being studied and looked at and would need to go to the board for approval. So we wanted to make sure that the community all knew that this is something we're looking at, so we can get input and it would be a transparent process. The other thing I wanted to mention is the enforcement at Pleasanton Ridge this past weekend. It was a trail known as the Christmas Tree Trail that I understand has been in existence. It is a user-created trail. It's been there for 20 years. And we don't have any information that there were environmental impacts. There may have been, but we don't have any information about that. It was a safety concern by the park staff, was the reason that enforcement action was requested by park staff, because somebody had been injured on the trail before. So just to kind of clarify the facts on that. And with that, I really apologize. I have to go. I wish I could stay. I know these are recorded, so I will watch the rest. And somebody, I think it was Joseph, said, mind the bright spots. And I think that's really great advice. And we can look at what other park agencies are doing, what other land managers are doing, look for those success stories, and figure out how to move this forward. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Christina. Thanks for being here.